I pushed open the warped door, and the smell of wet pine and cold ash rushed my face. My light found the wall first, a string of photographs clipped to wire, their edges curled by damp. In the beam, a younger version of my husband laughed, with a woman I didn't know, a baby riding his shoulders, tiny fingers tangled in his hair. Beneath the photos sat a small music box carved with vines. When I brushed it, the lid quivered, and a lullaby I'd heard 1,000 times in our kitchen trembled into the dark. The song I thought belonged to us belonged here. 12 hours earlier, I had been rearranging the silverware drawer because the house felt too quiet. A new email blinked on my laptop. No, not new, unread, scheduled, dated the morning before his heart gave out over oatmeal. Subject line: for when you're ready. Inside, no farewell, no apology, only a string of numbers and the line: follow this, Maggie. He rarely used my nickname in writing. The coordinates pinned a spot in northern Vermont I didn't recognize. Back roads, a patch of forest where maps fade to green. I closed the laptop and went to the porch. March had softened the snow into gray islands that sagged around the maple trees. His boots still waited by the door, their salt lines crusted like old tears. I slipped his watch from the dish by the sink, the glass nicked at 10 o'clock, and set it on the porch rail in the thin sun. Superstition, maybe. A way to ask the day to tell the truth. He had been the steady one, the engineer with a pencil behind his ear, the man who built decks for neighbors and checked tire pressure before long drives. He was also the man who changed the subject when I asked about his 20s, who called some wounds old business and left them unopened. We'd made 40 years out of 1,000 small, decent days. I believed that was enough. Now the coordinates glowed on my phone like a dare. Pace, not pleading, I told myself. If I went, I would go like a person who means to see things, not a widow chasing a ghost. I packed a thermos, a flashlight, a paper map. Vermont's back roads, don't trust cell towers, and tucked the watch into my coat pocket. I brushed my thumb over the nick at 10, a habit like prayer. On the way, North Route 7 shouldered through small towns with names that sound like old hymns: Shaftesbury, Arlington, Manchester. At a gas station that sold maple candies in burlap sacks, the attendant in a camo hat pointed with his chin when I asked about a road that didn't look like one. After the covered bridge, hang a right at the sugar house with the green roof. If you hit the dairy farm with the Holsteins, you've gone too far. His directions were a story, not a map, and somehow that made me trust them. While the tank clicked full, I called our daughter. "I'm doing a little drive," I said. "Where, Vermont?" A beat of silence. Because there's something I need to understand." She exhaled slow. "You sound sure?" "I'm not sure," I said. "I'm going anyway. Text me a pin when you land. Please." "I will." The radio offered a local station staffed by a woman with a warm laugh who read the weather like gossip. Snow flurries up near Stowe, sugaring season in full swing. Drive safe, folks. The air smelled like wood smoke even with the windows up. Somewhere past Rutland, the bars on my phone thinned to one, then none. The paper map became a comfort rather than a relic. The turnoff wasn't a turn so much as a shrug in the tree line. A sun-faded sign leaned in the ditch. "No winter maintenance." A crow hopped on the post and watched me pass like a toll-keeper with no hand to hold out. The road narrowed until it stopped pretending to be a road at all. Just twin grooves, where tires once insisted this was a way through. Half a mile in the GPS died with a soft, apologetic chime. I cut the engine. The hush was so complete I could hear the thermos settle in the cup holder. The pines held their breath. I put on Daniel's old glove liners, the ones warm at the knuckles, thin at the fingertips, and started walking. The forest had that late winter palette of pewter and linen. Last year's leaves lay matted under a crust of thaw. Sap buckets hung from a few maples, their lids clinking when wind fussed them. In the distance, a metal roof flashed through the trees and vanished. When I reached the clearing, the house rose out of it like a story someone quit telling, sagging porch-boarded windows, shingles peeled back like bark. I stood at the bottom step, my breath a pale gust. Grief, long a fog, sharpened into something with edges, a question with its hands on its hips. He had sent me here, to this exact place. Not to a widow's comfort, not to a scenic overlook for a symbolic cry, but to a building that remembered him. On the porch, I touched the doorframe. Someone years ago had carved 2 letters into the wood, D+E. I didn't know whether to laugh or sit down hard. I did neither. I took out the watch, pressed the cold face to the carved initials, and listened for the sound of my own foolishness. The only answer was a gust through the rafters that smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. The door yielded when I leaned my shoulder. The room beyond was dim, stitched with thin ropes of light where boards didn't quite meet. Dust rose like startled birds. I aimed my flashlight across the floor, one step another, and that was when the photographs on the wire swam up, caught in the beam like minnows. There he was, 20-something, hair longer, laughter wider. A woman leaned into him, eyes bright, the shape of her mouth tender and sure. In the next photo, a child about 2 sat on his shoulders, hands spread like gulls. In another, the same woman held the same child in front of the very porch I'd just crossed. On the back of one print in the handwriting I knew better than my own, Raven Hill, 1982. Heat climbed my neck. The room tilted a fraction like a boat taking a swell. I braced a palm on the table. There are moments when anger is clean, righteous, a blade that points outward. This wasn't that. This was anger braided with humiliation, with envy for the woman whose name I didn't know, with a sudden vicious doubt. Had I been the replacement part in a machine already designed? I put the blade back in its sheath. I breathed. I catalogued. Evidence first, verdicts later. On the mantel sat the music box. I turned the key a half revolution. Those frail notes are notes spooled out into the cold. It wasn't betrayal that made my throat tighten. It was recognition. He had hummed it at our sink because he had learned it here. He had carried this sound like a pocketed stone through the decades, polishing it smooth on the inside of his palm. My flashlight found a table, and on it an envelope with my name in his careful slant. Not Maggie this time. Margaret. Formal. When he was serious, he used the version of me my mother liked. I slid the letter into my coat without opening it. Not yet. Not in a room that belonged to someone else's laughter. On the way out, I took one photo, the one where the child's fingers vanished into his dark hair, and slipped it into the inner pocket with the letter and the watch. On the porch, I touched the carved initials again. The nick at 10 on the watch face caught a shred of low sun and burned for a second like an ember. I don't know who you were here, I said to the trees, which is to say to myself. But I will. I locked the door behind me, though I didn't know who I thought I was keeping out, and followed my own boot prints back through the thawing woods toward the car, and the thin ribbon of road with its sugar houses and its crow and its small towns where everyone knows who used to own what. By the time I reached the highway, the light had gone the color of pewter again. I drove south with the radio off, listening to the kind of silence that isn't empty, but waiting. Home would still be there, the chair with its empty cushion, the drawer with the neat nests of spoons, the porch rail where a watch face learns to hold whatever light it can. I would boil water, read the letter, draw a map not just of turns but of names. If this was a betrayal, I would name it. If this was a life he had failed, I would name that too. And if somewhere in the naming a door opened between grief and something like truth, I would walk through. The kettle screamed before I did. I snatched it off the burner, poured water over a bag of black tea, and watched the steam braid itself into the kitchen's stillness. The envelope lay in the center of the table, its edges warped by damp air from the drive home. I'd promised myself I'd wait until morning, but the promise felt childish now, like believing the dark stays outside if you don't look. The handwriting was his neat, precise engineer, steady. Margaret, it began. No preamble, no apology. If you found this, it means you opened the coordinates. I didn't tell you about that part of my life because I didn't know how to without undoing everything good we built. Her name was Evelyn. The child Lily was mine. I was 25, and stupidly certain I could save everyone. When Evelyn got sick, she made me promise to keep Lily safe, and the only way I knew how was to leave. I failed both of them, and in time, I failed you too, by keeping silent. I'm sorry for that. The house isn't a secret. It's the beginning of a map I never finished. There's something under the floor by the hearth. It belongs to Lily. If you can find her. Tell her I did try. I just ran out of courage. The rest trailed into a shaky signature. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and engine oil him. I read it twice, then a third time, the way you press a bruise just to make sure it's real. Anger rose first, clean, sharp, necessary. You let me build 40 years on half a foundation. I wanted to slam the cup against the sink to make something shatter since he wasn't here to hear it. Instead, I carried his watch outside and set it on the porch rail again. The sky was pewter, the trees black silhouettes against it. The watch hands had stopped at 10, same as the nick in the glass. Maybe it had broken the morning he died. Maybe it stopped because some things refuse to move forward until you do. I sat on the steps, let the cold bite through the robe's fabric, and whispered to the dark, "You should have trusted me, Daniel." The wind didn't bother to answer. The next day, I did something I'd avoided since the funeral. I called his best friend, Henry. He answered on the second ring, voice gravelly with surprise. "Maggie, you all right?" "Not exactly. I need to ask about something you might not want to remember." He sighed. "That covers most of our 20s. Did you ever know a woman named Evelyn, or a place called Raven Hill?" The line went quiet long enough that I thought it had dropped. Then softly, "He told you." "Not really. He left breadcrumbs. I figured he would one day." Paper rustled, maybe a cigarette lighter flicked. "Raven Hill was where he went after college. There was a fire there." "You didn't know?" My throat went dry. "No. He never told you about that winter Evelyn had TB. He was trying to build some contraption to make the cabin warmer without smoke, typical Daniel project. But the chimney clogged. She didn't make it. After that, he disappeared for a while. Came back thinner, quieter. I thought he'd buried that whole life." "Not buried," I said, "just hidden." Henry exhaled. He carried guilt like a religion, Maggie. If he's asking you to find Lily, maybe he finally forgave himself enough to want her found. Or maybe he's trying to hand the guilt to me. He wouldn't, but he knew you'd finish what he couldn't. That was both comfort and condemnation. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with the map spread open and a new question unfolding beside the old ones. If he'd loved Evelyn so deeply he couldn't let her go, then what was I to him? Companion redemption project replacement. The thought curdled the tea in my stomach. I pushed the cup away and traced the map's thin blue veins toward Burlington. If Lily had been placed in Vermont foster care, she'd have left paper behind, school records, medical files, something. And if not, I would make noise until someone answered. By afternoon, I was in the local library, squinting at microfilm under the humming machine. The librarian, a gentle man with a Red Sox mug, brought me reels from the 1980s. "Whitmore, right?" he asked after my third request. There was an obituary. Tragic story. Mother and child separated. He slid the spool onto the reader. The grainy headline appeared: "Evelyn Whitmore, 29, dies after long illness. Daughter placed with local family. No father listed." I copied the article, my pen trembling at the last line. "Arrangements handled by St. Mary's Orphanage, Burlington." The name was my next compass. Outside, clouds massed over the ridgeline, bruised purple with snow. I pulled my coat tighter and felt the letter crinkle in my pocket. The words under the floor by the hearth burned through the fabric like an ember. I hadn't lifted the plank. I'd been too stunned. Now the omission felt cowardly. I drove back toward Raven Hill before I could change my mind. The road was worse in daylight, ruts hardened into ridges, meltwater gleaming like broken glass. The crow was back on its post, same indifferent tilt of the head. When I reached the clearing, a truck was parked near the tree line. I froze. The air tasted metallic. A man stepped from behind the porch, older, gray-bearded, wearing a maintenance parka with a county emblem. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said. "I'm just surveying old lots. You the owner?" I hesitated. "I might be," I said. "Was this place ever registered to a Whitmore?" He scratched his chin. "Long time ago. Belonged to a young couple. Guy disappeared after the wife passed. Folks said he went west." His gaze lingered on me, curious. "You kin?" "Sort of," I managed. He nodded toward the porch. "Floors rotted near the hearth. Watch your step if you go in." After he left, I went inside. The cold hit like a held breath. Dust lay thick, undisturbed except for my own prints from yesterday. I knelt by the hearth, ran my palm along the boards until one dipped slightly. A seam. I wedged my pocket knife into it, pried up the plank. Beneath, a tin box waited, its edges flaked with rust. Inside, a ring with a cracked pearl, a child's drawing of a house with smoke curling upward, and another envelope, this one addressed not to me, but to Lily Whitmore. I didn't open it. My fingers itched to, but some lines of respect survive even death. I set it back carefully, then noticed a second folded sheet wedged beneath the ring. On it, in Evelyn's handwriting: "Daniel, if you find this before I'm gone, promise me 2 things. Keep her warm and keep her away from here. Let her remember laughter, not the sound of me coughing through the walls." The ache that bloomed then was complex grief, jealousy, mercy, all twisting together. Evelyn hadn't stolen Daniel. She had suffered beside him. And he had kept his promise, too literally, turning warmth into exile. I replaced the board, stood slowly. The house seemed to settle with me, a long exhale through its ribs. I whispered to the empty air, "I'll find her, Evelyn. I'll tell her both of you tried." The crow cawed once outside as if taking attendance. I almost laughed. When I reached the car, snow began again, thin flakes swirling like ashes. I watched them melt against the windshield, felt the letter in my coat like a second pulse, and started the engine. Next stop, Burlington. Snow followed me north like a patient companion, veiling the road until it looked more memory than map. By the time I reached Burlington, the world had dissolved into shades of white and slate. I parked near the waterfront where the lake stretched wide and gray as sheet metal, and sat for a moment with the engine running, trying to collect the threads of everything I'd just learned. Evelyn, Lily, promises kept too tightly. The orphanage from the newspaper, St. Mary's Home for Children, had been converted into an administrative building years ago. The receptionist, a woman with reading glasses dangling from a chain, listened while I explained I was researching a family matter. I held Daniel's letter folded small enough to hide the shaking of my hands. Her smile was polite but wary. "Records from that era are sealed. Privacy laws, you understand. Even for relatives." I nodded as though I did. "I'm not asking for much. Just to know if she's all right. Lily Whitmore, born 1981 or 82. Her mother was Evelyn." The woman hesitated, the practiced bureaucracy flickering for a second into something human. "I can't confirm identities, but if you leave your contact information—" "I already did," I said softly, 40 years ago. Something in my tone made her look up. She studied me a long moment before scribbling a note on her pad. "Come back tomorrow morning." I can't promise anything, but sometimes files misfile themselves for a day. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a door slammed either. I checked into a small inn by the river, the kind with knitted throws and a front desk run by a woman who called everyone Hon. In the room, I turned the TV to low news hum and spread my notes across the quilt. Daniel's letter, Evelyn's words, the photograph of the child on his shoulders. I laid them out like evidence on a detective's board. There was logic in grief. It liked to assemble clues to turn pain into an equation with a solvable end. But every time I tried to write a timeline, I ended up tracing the edges of Lily's face. Instead, the half smile, the soft curls. At midnight, I opened the window. The snow had stopped. The streetlights turned each flake in the air into a suspended secret. Daniel's watch ticked faintly in my pocket, though it hadn't moved in days. The next morning, I returned to St. Mary's. The receptionist wasn't at her desk. Instead, a younger woman waited, a file folder in hand. She didn't smile. "You're Margaret?" "Yes." She nodded, glancing around before lowering her voice. "I shouldn't be doing this. But the child you asked about was adopted in 1986. The file was thin, likely a private adoption, but there's a note from the caseworker. She was placed with a family in Dorset." "Dorset," I repeated, tasting the name like a prayer. The woman slid a small slip of paper across the counter. "That's all I can give you. The rest is sealed." I took it, my gratitude heavy with guilt. "Thank you." "Ma'am," she said softly, "be careful with what you find." Dorset sat tucked between hills, a postcard town where everyone waved, but no one hurried. I stopped at the library first. Old habits die hard. The librarian, a man with silver hair and hands ink-stained from cataloging, looked up as I entered. "I'm looking for someone," I began. "Her name might be Lily, but she could have changed it after adoption." He smiled faintly. "We get that more often than you'd think. Small towns keep ghosts." I laughed, surprising myself with the sound. "Do you keep records of local obituaries or alumni registries from the 90s? He gestured toward a back table stacked with yearbooks. "Start with the high school. If she grew up here, she's probably in one of these." Hours passed in quiet, paper-scented time. Faces of smiling teens, hairstyles evolving with the decades until in the 1999 volume, my hands stilled. Lily Whitmore, class of 99. Not Whitmore anymore. Lily Hayes. The caption, "Future nurse. Compassion is strength." I stared at the photograph until it blurred. She had Evelyn's eyes and Daniel's jaw. A note in the alumni section listed her as working at Green Mountain Regional Hospital, Burlington. Full circle. My heart thudded once solid as a gavel. Driving back through the snow, I rehearsed what I would say. "I was your father's wife." No too abrupt. "I knew Daniel. Worse. He left something for you." Too much like a con. At the hospital front desk, I chickened out halfway through the sentence. "I'm looking for Nurse Lily Hayes," I said, "but it's not urgent." The clerk checked her screen. "She's on shift till 6. You can wait in the lobby if you like." I sat among potted ferns and magazines, 2 months out of date, clutching the sealed envelope meant for Lily. I hadn't opened it, but I could feel the gravity of what was inside like a second heartbeat. At 6:15, she appeared at the far end of the corridor, her badge catching the light. She was taller than I'd expected, with calm, deliberate movements, the kind nurses have when every second counts. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like watching Daniel's younger self step into focus through her. I stood unsure if my legs would hold. "Lily." She turned, polite confusion on her face. "Yes." Words tangled. I forced them loose. "I knew your father." Her expression shifted just slightly. "My father? Daniel Whitmore. He passed away last winter." The air seemed to thicken between us. "You must be mistaken," she said gently. "I never knew my father. He left before I was born." I swallowed. "He never stopped watching over you?" Something flickered in her eyes, skepticism or hope, I couldn't tell. "Who are you?" "I'm his wife," I said finally. "I didn't know about you until after he died, but he wanted you to have this." I held out the envelope. She looked at it like it might burn. "Why now, after 40 years?" "Because he ran out of time," I whispered. "And I think he wanted you to have the truth before I do." She didn't take it right away. "You expect me to believe this? Some stranger shows up with a story about the father who never wanted me." "He did," I said, the words trembling. He just didn't know how. Her jaw tightened the way Daniel's did when he was angry but didn't want to show it. You should leave. I didn't argue. I placed the envelope on the chair beside her and turned toward the exit. At the door, I looked back once. She was still standing there, envelope in hand, the snow beginning to fall behind the glass. Outside, the cold felt cleaner than the air inside. I didn't know if she'd open it or if she'd ever want to see me again. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt something close to peace, a crack small, but real, in the ice of grief. Tomorrow I would drive home. Or maybe if she called, I wouldn't. The storm chased me home. Wind pressed at the car like a giant sigh, and snow smeared the windshield until the world looked watercolor soft. By the time I reached our driveway, darkness had pooled across the yard, and the porch light glowed like a small mercy. Inside the house was colder than it should have been. I lit the wood stove, fed it kindling until the flames caught and sank into the old armchair Daniel had claimed as his. The room smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, his scent faint but stubborn. I thought of Lily's face at the hospital, composed, professional, but trembling at the edges. The disbelief in her eyes wasn't anger, it was defense. She'd built an entire identity on absence. Then I had walked in and cracked the foundation. The envelope she hadn't opened was still burned into my mind. What had he written? A confession. An apology. Something that would make sense of 40 years of silence. I rose and poured myself a glass of scotch, his scotch, the one I never liked, and sat back down with his first letter in hand. Reading it again, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint indent beneath his signature, as if he'd pressed the pen too hard. I tilted the page toward the firelight. Beneath the inked words, another line emerged, almost invisible. There's a second key, Maggie, the one you gave me on our first anniversary. My heart stumbled. The key. It hung on the same ring as his truck fob, which still sat in the ceramic dish by the door. I retrieved it, a small brass key with a heart cut into the bow. It had been part of a matching pair I'd bought for our first apartment. I'd forgotten it completely. I turned it over, and there, etched into the metal, nearly worn smooth, R.H. Raven Hill. So the key wasn't sentimental, it was practical. Which meant something else at that cabin was still locked. I didn't wait for morning. The road to Raven Hill had frozen over the ruts, transformed into ridges of ice that cracked beneath the tires. My headlights cut narrow tunnels through the snowfall. Every instinct screamed that this was madness, driving through a winter storm to pry open a ghost's hiding place, but logic had lost its authority over me. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood hunched against the snow like an animal bracing for a blow. I parked, left the engine idling for warmth, and pushed through drifts that reached my knees. The wind tore at my scarf, flinging it behind me like a flag. Inside, the air was thick with cold and memory. I knelt by the hearth again, fingers numb, and found the floorboard I'd lifted before. Beneath the tin box, I noticed something else, a square of metal embedded in the foundation, a tiny lock nearly invisible under grime. The key fit. When it turned, a soft click echoed through the floor, and a section of the stone hearth shifted outward with a groan. Behind it, a hidden compartment revealed a small metal cylinder sealed with wax. Inside, a folded sheaf of papers, Daniel's handwriting again, fainter, shakier. If you're reading this, it means you found what I couldn't face. I tried to reach Lily once. I went to Burlington the year she graduated high school. I watched her from across the street as she left the hospital where she volunteered. She laughed with a patient God. She had Evelyn's smile. I couldn't go to her. She looked happy, safe. I told myself she didn't need me. But the truth is, I didn't know how to tell her that the fire wasn't an accident. I caused it, Maggie. The heater I built to keep Evelyn warm, it backfired. She didn't suffer long, they said, but I never believed them. I buried her behind the cabin because I couldn't bear to leave her in town where people would whisper. I kept her ring, her note, and our daughter's drawing, and I left Raven Hill to become someone else. You met that someone, the man who pretended his past was just a place he'd outgrown. I thought love could overwrite guilt. Maybe it did for a while. Find Lily if you can. Tell her the truth. I was too cowardly to speak. Her mother died because I tried to save her, and I spent the rest of my life trying to make that right. Maybe this letter won't redeem me, but maybe it'll free you both. I let the papers fall into my lap. The sound they made was thin, like a sigh through dry leaves. The fire crackled faintly, the only other sound. He hadn't been hiding a secret love. He'd been hiding a death. I pressed my hand to my mouth. The air was too thick to breathe. For 40 years I had known the tender, careful version of him. The one who measured screws twice, who sang off-key while fixing the gutters. Not the man who had built a machine that killed someone. But both men were real. Both had loved, failed, repented. By the time I drove back, dawn was leaking into the sky. Snow dripped from the eaves like beads of glass. I laid the papers on the kitchen table and stared at them until the words blurred. He had asked me to tell her. That was his final request. Not forgiveness. Not understanding, just the truth. I picked up the phone and dialed the hospital. The receptionist recognized my voice before I could introduce myself. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore, Nurse Hayes asked us to give you this message. She said she read the letter." I held my breath. "She wants to meet you, tomorrow, at the lake." The words sank through me like sunlight through snow. That night, I didn't light the stove. I sat by the dark hearth holding the second letter. For the first time, I whispered his name without bitterness. "You should have told me," I said softly, "but thank you for letting me find it." The watch in my pocket ticked once, just once, and stopped again. The lake wore its morning mist like a shawl, gray and luminous. Waves whispered against the shore, thin as breath. I parked near the frozen dock and stepped out the cold, gripping my lungs in its patient fist. Lily's message had said only 8 a.m. Lake Champlain North Pier. No greeting, no explanation. Just coordinates again, as if my life had become a series of maps drawn by ghosts. She was already there. Standing near the edge, her coat drawn tight, hair tucked under a knitted cap. When she turned, her expression was neither hostile nor welcoming, just wary, the look of someone who had learned that truth is a double-edged thing. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "Margaret," I corrected gently. "Please." She nodded, eyes flicking to the envelope in my hand. I read his letter. I waited. It was a lot. Her breath hung in the air between us, curling like smoke. "He said he killed my mother." "He said it was an accident," I replied. "He tried to build something to save her." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "That sounds like something my mother would have loved him for." I took a step closer, boots crunching on the frost. "He carried that guilt for the rest of his life. He didn't tell me because he thought he didn't deserve to love again." Her eyes glistened, so I was his ghost. "No," I said more sharply than I intended. "You were his hope. The proof that something he broke could still grow in the world." She turned away, arms crossed against the cold. "When I was little, I used to imagine my father was alive somewhere watching. I'd draw pictures of him on mountains, on boats, even at the moon. My adoptive parents humored me. Then I stopped believing. Now you show up with proof that I was right and wrong." "I wish I'd known sooner," I said. "I would have brought him here myself." She was quiet for a long moment. The lake cracked somewhere offshore, a sound like the world exhaling. "When I first read the letter," she said finally, "I hated him. Then I hated myself for wanting to forgive him. That's normal." "I don't want normal." She turned to me, tears bright on her lashes. "I want to know if he ever thought about me, not as an obligation, not as guilt." I took the small tin box from my bag, the one I'd found under the floorboard, and placed it on the frozen railing between us. "He kept these for 40 years, I said. Your drawing, your mother's note, her ring. They were the only things he saved when he left." Her hand shook as she opened the lid. When she saw the drawing, she gasped. "I made this. I was 2, maybe 3. She used to hang it by the stove." Her voice cracked. I remember the smell of smoke. I reached out instinctively but stopped short of touching her. He blamed himself for that smell. She pressed the drawing to her chest. He should have come back. I told him that every day I didn't know it. She looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. Why are you doing this, Margaret? You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, I said softly, but I owe him this. He asked me to tell you the truth, and maybe I owe it to myself to see the part of him I never knew. The wind lifted a strand of her hair. She tucked it behind her ear, her movements gentler now. He mentioned you, she said. In the letter. Said you made him believe in grace again. Grace. The word landed like a prayer I didn't know I'd been saying all along. We walked the shoreline together, our steps matching in the snow. She asked about him, his habits, his laugh, the way he'd tap his thumb against his watch when he was thinking. I told her everything I could remember and a few things I'd once promised myself I'd forget: his temper when he lost patience, the way silence could hang heavy after our rare arguments. The man she learned about wasn't perfect, but he was whole. After a while, she stopped. I don't know what to do with all this, she said. You don't have to do anything right now. Just breathe in it. She smiled faintly. That sounds like something he'd say. I laughed. Maybe he's still giving both of us advice. The mist began to thin, revealing sunlight trembling on the water. Lily turned toward it, eyes half closed. He said in the letter that he was too much of a coward to face me, but maybe he left us to finish what he started. I nodded. A bridge, maybe, between the life he lost and the one he tried to build. She looked at me for a long time before speaking again. Would you come back tomorrow? There's a cafe near the hospital. I'd like to hear more about him. About you. Something in my chest loosened like a knot finally yielding. I'd like that, I said. She reached out then hesitantly and touched my hand. Her skin was cold but steady. I think I want to see the cabin, she said quietly. Where it happened. Where he lived. I hesitated. It's not an easy place. I don't think easy is what either of us needs. We stood in silence, two women linked by a man neither of us fully knew. The lake stretched endlessly ahead, the horizon pale with promise. I thought of Daniel's second letter, the confession of failure, the plea for honesty, and realized this was what he'd been trying to give us all along, not redemption, but recognition. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine from the hills. Somewhere, a gull cried. I could almost hear his voice in it, soft and steady. You found her, Maggie. That's enough. I smiled into the wind. No, I whispered. Not yet. But we're getting there. 2 days later, we drove together toward Raven Hill. The road wound through Vermont's backcountry like a ribbon of ice framed by maples heavy with frost. Lily drove this time, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes forward, determined. I rode beside her, clutching the tin box like a relic. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It felt alive like air before a storm. The snow had stopped by the time we reached the old trailhead. The cabin waited at the end of a long white corridor of trees, its roof bowed under a decade of neglect. Lily parked the car but didn't move to get out. So this is where he hid, she murmured. Not hid, I said, haunted. She nodded slowly. I can feel it. We walked the rest of the way in silence, our breath rising in clouds. Each step crunched against the frozen ground, the sound sharp and final. When we reached the porch, I handed her the key. He left this for you, I said. Her fingers brushed mine as she took it. The touch was brief, but grounding. She slipped the key into the lock. It turned easily, like the door had been waiting for her all this time. Inside, time hadn't moved. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. The single chair, the empty hearth, the walls stained by smoke, it was all exactly as I'd left it. The weight of memory pressed down until my knees felt weak. Lily stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. It's smaller than I imagined. He never talked about this place, I said. But it was always with him, in every silence, every shadow. She crouched near the hearth, tracing her hand over the spot where the floorboard had concealed his letters. "This is where you found them." "Yes." She nodded, her voice low. "He built machines, didn't he? Heating systems tools? I used to love taking apart my mother's toaster just to see how it worked." She gave a soft laugh that broke halfway through. "Maybe I got that from him." "You did," I said. "He used to say the world made more sense when he could fix something with his hands." Her eyes glistened. "But not everything can be fixed." "No," I said quietly, "but some things can be faced." We spent the next hour moving through the cabin carefully, reverently. She examined every object as if collecting pieces of a life she'd been denied. A rusted lantern, a chipped mug, a photograph of Evelyn hidden behind a loose beam, her smile faint but unbroken. At one point, Lily knelt near the wall and brushed away a layer of dirt. Underneath, carved into the wood, were 3 initials: EWDWLW. Her fingers traced them slowly. "He carved my name," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "He never forgot you." She sat back, wiping her eyes. "When I was a kid, I used to draw hearts with 3 letters, mine, my mom's, and an empty one. I'd tell my teacher it was for my dad. She'd smile, but she never asked why the heart was always cracked in the middle." I sat beside her. "It doesn't have to stay that way." Lily exhaled shakily. "I don't know if I can forgive him." "You don't have to yet," I said, "but you can try to understand him." She nodded. "Maybe that's a start." We stepped outside just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The world was gold and white, every branch glittering with frost. Lily turned toward the edge of the clearing where a small stone marker jutted from the snow, a simple, unmarked grave. She hesitated. "Is that—" "Yes," I said softly. "Evelyn." We approached slowly. The snow around it was untouched. I knelt first, brushing away the frost, revealing the faint outline of Daniel's handwriting carved into the stone. "Forgive me. Rest in light." Lily's breath caught. "He buried her here." "He couldn't leave her," I said. For a long while she said nothing. The forest stood still, waiting. Then she crouched beside the grave and placed the tin box gently on the earth. "I think she should have it back," she whispered. I laid my hand over hers. "He'd like that." We stayed there until our fingers went numb. When we finally rose, she turned to me, her eyes red but clear. "Do you think he's at peace now?" I thought of Daniel's trembling handwriting, his confession, his regret. "I think he's closer than he's ever been." On the drive back, neither of us spoke for miles. The road wound between frozen fields and pine ridges, the world reduced to silver and shadow. Then quietly, Lily said, "You know, he used to stand outside the hospital." I didn't believe it when I first read it, but I remember a man. Once. I was maybe 17. He was standing near the bus stop watching. I thought he looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. When I turned around again, he was gone. Her voice cracked. "It was him, wasn't it?" I nodded. "Yes." She pressed a hand to her mouth, a sound between a sob and a laugh escaping her. "All these years I thought I was imagining it. Sometimes," I said, "the truth hides in the smallest memories." She smiled faintly. "Thank you for finding me, Margaret." I looked out at the snow-lit road, the mountains ahead bathed in dusk. "He led me to you," I said. "I just followed the map." When we reached Burlington, Lily pulled into a small diner off the main road. "One more thing," she said, stepping out. Inside, the warmth hit like sunlight. She ordered 2 coffees and slid into a booth across from me. "Do you think love can survive after everything?" she asked suddenly. I stirred my coffee, watching the swirl of cream dissolve. "I think love changes shape. Sometimes it becomes grief, sometimes forgiveness, but it never really dies." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe he's still here. Somewhere." I smiled. "In this booth, I'd say." We both laughed, a quiet, shared sound, like a crack in winter ice letting water breathe again. Outside, snow began to fall once more, soft, deliberate, endless. Spring came slowly to Vermont that year, reluctant to replace the snow. It was April before the ice finally loosened its grip on the lake, before the maples bled sweet sap again, and the smell of thawed earth filled the air. I visited Lily often. Sometimes we met for breakfast near the hospital. Sometimes we sat on her porch overlooking the valley, two women stitched together by silence and shared ghosts. She told me about her patients, about the long shifts, about how she'd started volunteering at an addiction clinic because people who hurt still deserve a chance to heal. She didn't say it, but I knew she was talking about her father. One morning, she showed up at my door with an envelope. It was smaller than Daniel's letters sealed with wax. "I found this in the tin box," she said. "Under the drawing. It was addressed to both of us." The handwriting was faint, but unmistakable. We sat by the kitchen window, the first light spilling across the floor, and I broke the seal. "Maggie. Lily. If by some miracle you're reading this together, it means I've run out of time and maybe found a little grace along the way. I don't ask you to forgive me. I just ask that you both keep living, for all the things I couldn't finish, for all the mornings I didn't deserve. There's one last thing I left at Ravenhill. Under the stove behind the stone marked EW. It isn't gold or confession. It's something Evelyn made before the fire. She called it the light that stays. Maybe it belongs to both of you now. Love, Daniel." Lily's hands trembled as I read. "Do you think he means—" "Only one way to find out," I said. The next day we returned to the cabin. The snow was gone, leaving the ground damp and smelling of pine sap. Inside, the air was warmer, the dust brighter in the sunlight that streamed through the broken window panes. We found the stone easily, the one marked EW, and pried it loose together. Beneath it was a small glass jar sealed with wax. Inside, a tiny oil lantern, the kind people once used for prayer. A note, faded but legible, was tied to its handle. "For the dark places, E." Lily turned the jar in her hands, the glass catching sunlight and scattering it across the walls like shards of gold. For a moment, the cabin seemed alive again, filled with the warmth of people who had once laughed and built and loved here. She placed the lantern on the hearth. "She made this for him," she said softly. "And he left it for us." We stood together, silent, watching the light dance across the walls. It wasn't burning, but somehow it glowed, reflected sunlight bending through glass and memory. Weeks passed. Lily came by often, and sometimes we spoke of Daniel, sometimes not at all. One afternoon she brought her dog, a golden retriever named Finn, and he bounded through the house like he'd always belonged. The sound of paws on wood made the place feel whole again. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, we lit the small lantern on my kitchen table. The flame flickered once, then steadied. "I used to think grief was an ending," Lily said. "Now it feels like a road." I nodded. "And every mile matters." She smiled. "You sound like him." Maybe I finally understand him. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was soft, like a blanket you could rest beneath. That night, after she left, I walked out onto the porch. The air was warm enough to carry the smell of wet grass and wood smoke from distant chimneys. I looked up. Vermont skies always feel close enough to touch, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't talk to the stars. I didn't need to, because the quiet itself felt like a response. A few days later, Lily sent me a photograph. It was of the cabin, newly repaired, the lantern glowing on the windowsill. Beneath it, she'd written, "The light that stays." I printed the picture and placed it beside Daniel's old watch. Both ticked in their own way. Sometimes when the house falls silent, I swear I can still hear his voice in the rustle of the maple trees. "Keep going, Maggie. You found her. You both found the light." I smile when that happens, because maybe he's right. Maybe love isn't what stays, it's what keeps leading you forward.